Welcome back to the Haircafe cinematic universe, hair loss witchers. Remember, a finasteride a day keeps the hair transplant doctor away. So, I was getting ready to make a totally different video for today, but yesterday, one of my viewers sent me this article that was just published a few days ago. The title is, quote, "Finasteride use does not lead to depression or suicide, insights from a large-scale cohort study and Mendelian randomization analysis," unquote. You could tell from the title alone that this article instantly rose to #1 in the charts in the Haircafe playlist. There was no question that I had to drop everything else and get this article analyzed for you chums as soon as I possibly could. You see, dismantling anti-finasteride propaganda is paramount to this channel's mission. If we are going to defeat the slaphead curse, then it is very important that we also defeat the rhetoric of anti-finasteride propagandists whose goal is to scare people away from legitimate treatments so that they'll be more likely to try scamful products instead that don't work. And yes, Hair Guard, I am talking about you. And it's not just scammers and ambulance-chasing anti-finasteride groups that have contributed to this big problem. The regulatory agencies have not helped either. Under pressure from anti-finasteride organizations and based on flawed databases like the FAERS FAIRS database, both the FDA and the European Medicines Agency have added warnings to the finasteride labeling about the possibility of finasteride causing depression and suicide. In the case of the FDA, they even did this while admitting that there was no scientific evidence supporting adding that warning at all. They basically just folded the pressure from the PFS Foundation. The FDA based this change in the finasteride labeling on the FAIRS database that supposedly showed a link between finasteride and depression. But the FAIRS database is about the least reliable source of information about the risk of drugs you can possibly imagine. You might as well just get your information from Reddit or TikTok because it is just as unreliable. And that's because anyone can make a report to the database and none of the reports are verified in any way whatsoever. They just expect us to take it on faith that all these anecdotes are real. If you look at the number of reports in the database, it's clear that all the anti-finasteride hysteria in the 2010s is what actually stimulated a huge increase in reports of finasteride side effects. These reports were almost non-existent before 2011. I mean, just look at this. It's remarkable how much the rise of anti-finasteride fear-mongering perfectly coincides with the marked increase in reports about adverse effects. It's clear that finasteride fear-mongering is what is actually causing this increase in reports. Thankfully, despite these reports, no one has taken finasteride off the market just yet, but that has always been the not-so-secret goal of groups like the PFS Foundation. It's unbelievably selfish that there are people who think that just because they're too scared to take finasteride, that no one else should be able to take it either. It's clear that they're jealous of the people who can take finasteride without issues, so they're trying to get it off the market so they can better cope with their own failures. But if you are a finasteride hater, then I'm about to tell you the worst possible news you can possibly imagine hearing. We have this new article from China, and it is a devastating blow to all the organizations that profit off of hair loss sufferers' misery by spreading the false narrative that taking finasteride causes depression and drives them to suicide. It turns out that's all complete bullshit. So this article has two parts. The first part used a randomization technique called Mendelian randomization, also called MR, which is a tool that has been used frequently in recent years to prove or to disprove causality when there is an association between a risk factor and an outcome. For example, MR has been used as evidence that lowering LDL cholesterol decreases the risk of heart disease, which is the blue line on this graph you can see right here. Though as you can see, MR studies are only one type of study proving this connection. There are also prospective observational studies and true randomized controlled studies of dietary and drug interventions to lower LDL cholesterol. Put together, all this data is completely overwhelming, even if carnivore influencers pretend otherwise. And let's face it, the finasteride haters and the carnivore diet lovers are the same people. Conspiracy theorists tend to stick together after all. But I don't want to get too off track here. I've already made plenty of videos clowning on the carnivore diet death cult as it is. Mendelian randomization has also been used to prove things like drinking alcohol causes esophageal cancer, and even the link between smoking and lung cancer that was established back in the 1960s by observational studies has been confirmed by using MR studies. So, I'll explain how Mendelian randomization actually works in just a moment. The second part of the article is an associative database study that uses a database that is much more reliable than the FAIRS database from from which all the fear-mongering about finasteride causing depression and suicide originally came from. So, the article starts out by reviewing the conflicting evidence linking finasteride use to depression. The authors first quote a terrible article by Dr. Earwig that was published back in 2012. For those who don't know, Dr. Earwig is a recurring antagonist in the Haircafe cinematic universe, second only to Dr. Trash and his anti-finasteride malevolence. The Dr. Earwig article compared 61 men who were recruited from a post-finasteride syndrome group and who were complaining of sexual problems. Dr. Earwig compared them to completely normal control subjects, and lo and behold, the men from the PFS forum were more depressed than the healthy men. Big fucking surprise, right? Of course, this is just junk research we're talking about here, chums, and it has a massive selection bias problem too. It doesn't show at all that the men's symptoms were actually due to taking finasteride in the past, but this is the kind of data, along with the FAIRS data, that help to establish in the minds of many people that finasteride causes depression and suicide. This false sentiment is further amplified by scamming influencers who often fearmonger about finasteride so they can better promote their all-natural alternative programs or products. The authors of this new study then show that despite all the claims that finasteride causes depression, the data from studies linking finasteride to depression and suicide is actually not robust at all. For example, there is a large Swedish study of older men taking finasteride for benign prostatic hyperplasia that found a link between finasteride use and depression, but no link at all to suicide or dementia. However, one problem with that study is that men taking 5-AR blockers had a greater number of comorbid diseases, and obviously, the more illnesses you have, the more likely you are to get depressed. Also, there's another large study from the United States Veteran Administration Hospital System that showed no link at all between finasteride use and depression. So like I said, to try to resolve this question of whether finasteride causes depression or suicide, this new study used two techniques. One was Mendelian randomization, or MR, and the other was an analysis of a huge prospective observational database from the United Kingdom called the UK Biobank. So let's look at the Mendelian randomization part of the study first, because that is the most complicated and difficult part of the study to understand. So how does Mendelian randomization work? Well, assume that the FAIRS database is correct and that there is an association between finasteride use and depression. If it's just an association, then how do you prove that the association is causative, meaning that the finasteride actually caused the depression? Well, the best way to do this is with a double-blind randomized control trial. This type of study will randomize people to get either finasteride or a placebo treatment and then follow them up for several years. If the incidence of depression is higher in the finasteride group than in the control group, you can then say that finasteride causes depression. Of course, those types of large randomized control trials were already done decades ago, and there was no evidence finasteride caused depression. But the anti-finasteride groups are going to claim that those studies were wrong because they were funded by Big Pharma. But what these conspiracy theorists are failing to realize is that Big Pharma doesn't care about finasteride anymore. The drug has been off patent for over a decade now, so this new research is not being funded by Big Pharma, and it is completely independent of any corporate bias from the manufacturers of finasteride. So, this new research using Mendelian randomization is a way to achieve almost the same results as a randomized controlled trial, but at a much lower cost. So, let me give you an example of how Mendelian randomization is best used in order to give you an explanation of how this kind of research works. All people are born with small variations in their genes called polymorphisms. Some of these polymorphisms influence LDL cholesterol levels. For example, certain variants in the PCSK9 gene naturally lower LDL throughout your lifespan. If you compare the risk of heart disease in people who carry these LDL-lowering variants with the risk in people who do not carry them, you find that the carriers have a substantially lower rate of heart disease. Since these gene variants are assigned randomly at birth and are not influenced by lifestyle or environmental factors, these comparisons function like a randomized control trial created by Mother Nature. Individuals are effectively randomized at birth to have higher or lower lifelong LDL levels. If a genetic variant only lowers LDL and has no other effects, then this in turn reduces heart disease risk, and this proves that LDL cholesterol itself has a causal role in the development of heart disease. And like I showed, these MR studies of LDL cholesterol clearly show that having a lower LDL cholesterol level decreases your risk of getting heart disease. So in this new study from China. The investigators used a large genetic database from the United Kingdom to identify genetic polymorphisms that were associated with, get this, being prescribed finasteride. In other words, certain genetic variants slightly increased the likelihood that a person in the UK database had ever been given a finasteride prescription. I never thought there would be a gene associated with the likelihood of getting a finasteride prescription, but supposedly there is, and I'm glad that I have that gene. I mean, it may sound ridiculous, but it actually makes good sense, and I'll explain why in a minute. Once the researchers identified these genetic variants, the investigators looked for those same variants in several large genetic databases containing information about depression and suicide. They looked at whether people who are born with the finasteride-associated genetic variants had a higher risk of depression or suicide than the people who are born without them. This approach is based on the same principle as the LDL cholesterol example, but it is not quite as straightforward. And that's because being prescribed finasteride is closely tied to the underlying condition that it treats, specifically androgenetic alopecia and benign prostatic hyperplasia. So if the genetic variants associated with finasteride prescription also predicted depression in the outcome databases, it would be unclear whether the depression came from finasteride or from the underlying disease that led to the prescription in the first place. Fortunately, the analysis found no association between the finasteride-linked genetic variants and depression or suicide in any of the datasets. Across all the datasets they examined, the people with the finasteride-linked genetic variants did not have higher rates of depression or suicide than those without the genetic variants. A few of the early comparisons showed a small signal, but once the researchers corrected for the fact that they were testing several datasets, those signals disappeared. This means they were most likely just statistical noise and not real effects. So, the bottom line from the MR part of the study was that the genetic evidence does not support the idea that finasteride itself causes depression or suicide. If there is any effect at all, it is too small to be detected even in these very large genetic datasets. So, the Mendelian randomization data did not show any causative link between finasteride use and depression, though I have to admit the methods and statistics used in this part of the study are pretty complicated and kind of indirect. So I find the second part of the study to be much more interesting and robust because, forget about causation, this study shows that there isn't even an association between finasteride use and depression or suicide. If there isn't even a mere association, then there can't be causation, obviously, and the MR study isn't even strictly necessary. To show this lack of association, the investigators used a database called the UK Biobank. This database is a prospective database that tracks all prescriptions and all medical diagnoses in over 500,000 subjects from the United Kingdom. These subjects were followed for a period of 13.7 years. During the follow-up, there were 14,883 diagnoses of depression and 1,299 suicide cases that were reported. The bottom line was that there were 2.89 newly reported depression cases per year in finasteride users versus 2.9 newly reported depression cases per year in non-finasteride users. So there was no statistically significant difference in the incidence of depression or suicide in finasteride users versus non-users of the drug. And this held true even when accounting for confounding variables like age, sex, ethnicity, financial status, education levels, employment status, smoking status, alcohol drinking, and the amount of sleep. So, I think Dr. Wang and his colleagues in China must be followers of my channel because they make all the points I have made over and over again in my videos for years now. I'm glad my content is finally getting some mainstream coverage in the scientific community. Hell, it's about goddamn time, I say. First, these researchers point out that going bald just by itself can cause depression, which is something that should be extremely obvious to anyone except for the biggest bald copers on the internet. So any increase in depression amongst finasteride users may just be due to going bald, which is obvious since going bald is very depressing. Secondly, the authors of the study write, quote, "The negative mental effect of finasteride may be exaggerated as being spread by social media and the internet. An interesting fact is that few suicidal events were reported before depression was officially listed as one of the potential adverse effects of the finasteride label in 2011, the number of which increased exponentially after then. In contrast, the adverse event ratio remained relatively low in clinical trials. Therefore, it must be taken into consideration that the role of information from amateur resources such as comments on social media could amplify the depressive emotion in finasteride users," unquote. Bingo! I couldn't have said it better myself. Post-finasteride syndrome is a phenomenon of the internet and social media. The internet is where the trash of society dwell. And the thing about the internet is that the garbage that gets posted there stays up there forever. And since the quantity of bullshit on the internet greatly exceeds the amount of accurate information, it's very easy for misinformation and disinformation to dominate the narrative as it presently does. We live in a post-truth society, and post-finasteride syndrome is is just another conspiracy theory that grifters have taken advantage of to market their bullshit products and programs to the masses. So, the bottom line of the study is, quote, contrary to common knowledge, the causal effect of finasteride use was not determined to be significant on any depression or suicide outcome, which means taking finasteride medication for treating androgenetic alopecia or benign prostatic hyperplasia will not increase the risk of depression, unquote. Damn straight. So this is a blockbuster of a study. I think the most robust data is from the UK biobank database, which blows the FAERS database out of the water by every metric imaginable, but especially in terms of reliability. There are huge problems with the FAERS database. The FAERS database is not designed to establish risk or causality. It was just meant to detect potential post-marketing side effects from drugs, but it can't be used to prove that these side effects are actually related to the drugs. The UK biobank, on the other hand, is an actual prospective database. People are followed over time, and you can exclude people who already have depression at baseline from your analysis. FAERS has no baseline data at all. In the UK biobank, depression and suicide are diagnoses coded for by physicians. The FAERS database, on the other hand, is mostly just self-diagnosed and self-reported problems that may or may not be valid medical diagnoses. With the UK biobank, we know exactly how many people were actually taking finasteride, but with FAERS, there is no denominator. We have no idea how many people took finasteride and did just fine. Also, the UK biobank database includes factors like socioeconomic status, education levels, age, psychiatric history, medical history, and so forth. FAERS has none of these. Finally, people are followed over many years in the UK biobank, while with FAERS, it's just some random person filing a random report on the internet and then just disappearing into the ether forever. And we know that anti-finasteride groups like the PFS Foundation actively encourage people to file bogus reports on FAERS, so FAERS is inflated with these false reports, and so therefore it is virtually useless. But now, thanks to this Chinese study, we now have solid data that finasteride does not increase the risk of depression or suicide. Dutasteride doesn't either, but we already have zero data linking dutasteride to depression or suicide. But the anti-finasteride influence has been so strong that both the FDA and the EMA have added depression to the warning label of dutasteride, despite both agencies saying there is zero evidence of a link between dutasteride and depression. I think it's far past time for the FDA and the EMA to remove those bullshit labels, because by having them in place, they're rationalizing fear and ignorance that is rooted entirely in pseudoscience, which has now been officially debunked. So, it's time to put this myth that finasteride causes depression and suicide to rest once and for all. There's a lot of financial special interest tied to finasteride fearmongering. I mentioned hair loss scammers who want to scare people away from finasteride so that they'll try their natural garbage instead. But there are also a lot of legal special interests involved in this as well, like the PFS Foundation that hope to make money off of litigation. But this new study may be the straw that finally breaks the PFS Foundation's back forever. But that's only if we spread awareness about this new research. So I implore everyone who is watching this, including other hair loss influencers, to please spread the word about this research and don't let the finasteride haters weasel their way out of this one like they have so many times before. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all next time. God bless.